Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we're going to hear from Agrii's Rodger Shirreff, National Seed Business Manager, John Miles, Agrii's Seed Technical Manager, and Agrii's David Leaper, Seed Technical Specialist. With the launch of the new recommended list for cereals and oilseed rape, we're going to look into what's new. What does this mean for seed availability and the grower? And how can we use the recommended list to nurture the crops through the coming season? And this episode qualifies for BASIS and Noroso CBD points. So let's start off by understanding what is the value of the recommended list that's been around for, a long time. But what is its value? Rodger, let's start with you.
Well, the value, obviously, the value to me is the gross output potential of a crop to a grower versus the risk of actually growing that crop. And the list is very good at identifying nationally the potential of varieties. As Agrii, we look to qualify that ourselves with an early look at these varieties so that we can have our own independent results to back up what is recommended.
Yeah, and John, what is that independent work that you do at Agrii that backs up those results that we see in the recommended list?
Well, we run our own sets of variety trials. They do differ slightly in terms of being on farm with farm inputs, and that does tend to give you a sort of a regional skew depending on the disease that's most prevalent and whether the program on the farmers has been strong enough to do it. So we're sort of RL data, RL yields, but on a slightly different input regime. But you need that high input regime because, you're trying to push these varieties to find out the ones that are ultimately the very, very best. And if you don't set a very high bar, guess what? Lots of stuff will creep in underneath it. So I've always defended the RL in terms of that ultimate aim and making sure that there are a smaller number of high quality varieties that growers can choose from. With ours, we supplement the RL. We've never wanted to try and replace it, but we do different trials. We do specific lodging trials, looking at various inputs and seed rates and the combination that plays out. And probably the jewel in the crown has obviously been the blackgrass competition work that we've spoken about on many podcasts, Tony.
We certainly have, John, and it's a great reminder for our listeners that do go back and revisit some of the podcasts that we've recorded previously. David, thinking about oilseed rape, what's the value of the RL for you? And what else would you like to add to what Rodger and John have also shared?
It's fair to say that the recommended list produces some really good benchmarking information about variety performance and all of the characteristics that we've come to contrast and compare varieties on. But there are some gaps, and I think the biggest gap we've had over the last 5 years is key information on growth habit and how these varieties can cope with the burden of both adult and larval damage from flea beetle and winter stem weevil. So we've done quite a lot of work where we've probably spent more time looking at sites where there's damage and trying to identify what particular characteristics might help. And that's been really revealing. And from our point of view, it's not about out and out gross output. It's about, is the variety going to survive and get through the punishing levels of larval damage that we're currently seeing? So we're doing that. We've also looked at things like late season stem health, because it's very clear that some of the leading varieties in the UK have died off prematurely and look terrible, and that impacts on late season pod fill. And so having an ability to cope with some of the late season diseases like verticillium are very useful. And we've been looking at that for the last few years, and it's only now that the AHDB are turning their attention to late season disease.
Fantastic. So I hear the real value of the recommended lists and the benchmarking that provides, but then also the additional work that you're doing at Agrii in terms of your R&D to complement that and provide farmers with even more on-farm trials-based data. Sounds fantastic. So let's think back to last year, what was recommended and what stood out, and let's think about the winter wheat crop to begin with. Rodger, can you start us off there? So what stood out and was a real success story?
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, I mean, Dawson was one of the star performers that we had from last year. The limiting factor with the Dawson was the amount of seed that was available. There was a very big interest in the crop. It turned out to deliver the goods at harvest time for growers, so it indeed proved itself as a worthwhile variety. And looking at Champion, and I'm looking at my colleague John, who might have further comment on the risks of Champion. From a gross output point of view for the grower, it was a very useful variety, but it does come with a warning, a health warning of standing ability. And John could maybe just comment a little bit further on that as to why we did have the attitude that we had towards it last year.
And that's an interesting point that Rodger makes. John, what are your thoughts?
Obviously, dry years, and you can push varieties very hard, but sometimes some negative traits can come through, and our attitude to lodging risk is quite strong. And we just had that question mark over Champion. I mean, no dispute. Its yield potential, but also what has continued its strong performance is very, very, very strong septoria resistance. And where we've had those challenges, then the variety comes through. The key thing is, as we've always said, if you're aware of a potential Achilles heel, you can adjust around it. So it wasn't a completely safe package, but there's a lot of positive points around Champion.
And what other varieties stood out and are therefore looking to be good prospects for next year?
Well, I mean, as Rodger said, things like Dawson have done well. Extaze has also done well. We took a position on Oxford, which is a sister variety to Champion. Gives a little percent or so away in yield, but does have better standing ability and better grain quality. So it's perhaps more suited to the eastern side of the country, where we not so needing to have such a strong septoria score. But last year, harvest results wise, some of the golden oldies, some of the tried and tested varieties also shone very well. So I think the key thing for me, Tony, is there is a lot of varieties out there. There's a lot of old stuff that, had we lost tebuconazole, would have probably disappeared, but actually performed well. There was good new varieties in the last few years, and now we've just had the release of a new RL with some good varieties on there. The question is where do they fit for Agrii and also as for a farmer?
And so therefore, in terms of winter wheat, what would you summarise as being those varieties that we really want to start considering going forward into next year? And from your point of view as Agrii, having done that extra work, what varieties would you pick out in addition to maybe those that the recommended list would be picking out and highlighting? Rodger, perhaps you'd like to comment.
Yeah, and I mean, we could actually, if you look at the new RL for this year, we could look at wheats by group, because we have a new recommendation in Group 1, Group 3 soft, Group 4 soft, and Group 4 hard. One hard is SY Chia. Now, SY Chia didn't make it onto the list because of its outright yield, because it's not the highest yield within that group, but we have a requirement for Group 1 wheats for quality in the UK. And certainly one of the strengths that it brings to the party over and above Skyfall and Zayat is its better resistance to yellow rust, which is something that farmers have been concerned about within Group 1s. And its accumulation of protein compared to Skyfall is excellent as well. So it's not just about out and out yield within the Group 1, it's about the quality, it's about the disease resistance, and the end market, indeed, that pulls that variety through. Because remember, it's not just the variety's own agronomics that give it a place, it's the end use of a variety. So certainly within Group 1, SY Chia is a welcome addition to the recommended list. Moving on to Group 3, we've got Bamford, which has been newly recommended. That's a Group 3 soft wheat. Now, Bamford coincidentally topped Agrii's trials across all varieties. Positive for distilling, and in the north with a yield above Skyscraper, certainly places it very, very well to take quite a market share going forward. Soft also has a new entry, which is Blackstone.
from the same breeders as Bamford, Elsams. And if you look at Blackstone, which we have done, we're targeting especially sales in the north. And take Redwold out the picture for a moment and said it's agronomically high risk. Blackstone would be our second highest yielding soft wheat in untreated and treated trials with Agrii, with the best specific weight of any Group 4 soft wheats in our 2023 trials. The disease in RL and Agrii trials align, with a 6 for Septoria resistance, strong yellow rust and mildew, and added to this by a strong Fusarium head blight score. It has the stiffest straw of any of the soft wheats, and it's the only variety with a bushel weight above 78 kilograms. John, if I could just bring you back in and add some more comment on chemistry.
I think the thing is, it's always about which gap are you needing to fill at whichever time and wherever in the country. Everybody has their own unique balance of disease pressures. You know, even things like Xtaze, there's still, generally speaking, 0.9, nearly a ton a hectare response. And I think largely some of that will come from early yellow rust and also late brown rust. So it really depends on what you're looking at, really. But I think, you know, if you look at some of the varieties that may have crept on in the last few years but have had zero or very little impact on the market, they may have a significant disease weakness or a significant agronomic weakness, such as lodging. And I think where, you know, Beowulf or as a hard 4 or Blackstone as a soft feed, or indeed Bamford, you know, you look across those and you're very hard pressed to find anything that's significantly worrying about any of the traits in those varieties. So not only are they coming in with a very high yield, but they're very solid packages all round.
Yeah, so a good base of varieties for farmers to choose from then going through into next year. David, I know you're quietly waiting in the wings there for when we come to oilseed rape, but anything you would like to add to the conversation here about winter wheat variety choices?
Well, the one thing we look at closely is the difference between treated and untreated yield. And that gives us, whether it's got a good rating in one disease or another, that gives us an indication of the resilience of that variety, particular diseases. So last year, we saw the dominance of yellow rust in the crop. This year, Septoria. So over the years, we see varieties with different levels of disease resilience. And of course, other varieties which are inherently good on things like Septoria and yellow rust may fall down for brown rust because of the parentage within many of the varieties. So disease resilience is important, and I think it's fair to say that we look at the response that a fungicide treatment has, and in most instances the yield loss to disease from a reasonable fungicide program justifies that program in almost every instance.
The must-have variety guide for 2024 is here. The Agrii Seed Spring Crops Yearbook is packed full of information that we hope you find useful. Link in bio. Let's now move on to winter barley. And John, could you take us through some of the watches on the RL?
Well, with winter barley varieties, there's been a smaller number on the market and also limited to just a handful with significant market share. In the last few years, KWS Tardis has dominated, and it's did well. You know, it's proven well on farm and in trials again this last year. But the new kid on the block was the mover and shaker was last year was LG Caravel, and it's it's raising the bar by a number of percent. It's also got better grain quality, good disease, and sort of adds some real competition. So Caravel, not as stiff as Tardis, but not a problem. With the stuff that's newly recommended this autumn, there is what is effectively looks like a sister line. I think it's similar genetics from the same breeder, is LG Capital that got recommended this autumn. Now, on the RL data, there is less than a fag paper between them, but in our trials, we are seeing bigger differences. Caravel has better mildew, better brown rust, better net blotch. For Rinco, they're quite similar, but in our trials, there's a 5% untreated yield difference across the variety trials. So So I think, yeah, Capital will obviously be of interest, but its biggest challenge is that Caravel to us looks a better all-round variety and is in the market sooner.
And what did the trial show from last year when it comes to differences in bushel weight?
I mean, Caravel did push things back up to Cassia-esque levels. So, really strong. And that is a unique selling point in the market. And Capital is somewhere close. But actually, it's not as robust. So whilst it looks high on the RL, across the trials, it varied, whereas Caravel held it really. So, yeah, some solid varieties in there with grain quality.
And what about ratings on, for example, BYDV, an issue for some parts of the country?
Well, it's been a sort of a sector that's been around for a few years now since it gained a special category. There has only really been one variety in that market, which is KWS Virus. That is a conventional 6-row. Now that 6-row, you say 6-row, and that can turn some people off. It's weak on brown rust and it's weak on mildew. So it's probably not the two diseases you'd really want. Well, none of the barley diseases if you want to sell so early in the highest BYDV risk areas. And surprisingly, even though we've had bad seasons for BYDV, we haven't seen a responding spike in sales. But there is a new BYDV recommendation. It comes into the hybrid barley category. It's still a 6-row, comes from Syngenta. It does, it's slightly higher yields. Probably for me, the key thing is it's much improved when it comes to mildew, but still has a bit of all of those material can have a bit of a challenge with brown rust. Standing ability and grain quality are pretty good. So there isn't a 2-row option as yet for growers if they want BYDV tolerance, but they do have a hybrid 6-row new available to them.
And Rodger, so for winter barley, what would be the watches on your list?
From if we're looking at the RL from Agrii's point of view, the Buzzard would be the one to watch if you're looking for BYDV tolerance. But although Capital is new to the list this year, we don't see enough in our trials that we would want to move established sales from Caravel. So I'm afraid it's not a new one to the list, but the recommendation would be that growers continue with Caravel as one of their highest yielding, most reliable winter barley options.
Yeah, thanks, Rodger. That's really clear. So let's now move on to oilseed rape, move away from cereals for a minute or two. David, from your perspective, in oilseed rape, you've touched on what the watches are. What varieties stood out from last year's recommended list and performed well?
It's fair to say that Lima grain have dominated oilseed rape plant breeding over the last 5 or 6 years, and they've been incredibly successful because they've integrated a number of traits, focusing on turnip yellow's virus, which is delivering higher yields, pod shatter resistance, RLM7 foamer resistance, and they've been stacking these traits and have been successful both in producing very consistent, reliable varieties and achieving significant market share. So, our success over the last number of years has been with varieties like Ambassador and more recently Auckland. And what we're seeing on the recommended list this year are 3 varieties that have come on, Armada, Academic and Adeline. And these, I suppose, are taking the varieties forward, because we have seen some of the older varieties, things like Aurelia particularly, showing relatively poor late season plant health. And the newer varieties from Lima grain are much more robust late in the season. Better verticillium, better late season light leaf spot resistance, and that's nudging up yields. So if we look at some of the varieties in the market like Aurelia, we're going to see that decline, and these varieties, newer varieties, take over. We took the decision 3 years ago to introduce Auckland, and that sits really well on the recommended list and has many of these traits. So the pressure for us to move to a new Lima grain variety isn't really there at the moment, and I suppose it's watch this space, because I think what's happened with Lima grain, because they have a wealth of varieties, they're using that opportunity to segment the market. So different retailers have their own variety.
And so the varieties that would be on the top of your list, based on last year's work, would be?
Well, we have a very strong position with Auckland. We retain a very strong position with a variety or a couple of varieties which we've sold for 5 years or more, X-Steel and NB 1035. Last year, we took a decision to move to Turing, which is a non-turnip yellows virus resistance variety, but has been really consistent in terms of its overall disease resistance and yield performance. And also a variety called RGT Kansas, which was a candidate. It didn't get onto the recommended list, but we had identified that had got a really vigorous growth habit in the spring that helped offset the effects of larval damage. So whilst that hasn't got recommended, we're sticking with it.
And so thinking about the RL and all of the R&D that you have done as Agrii, what seed stocks are you multiplying? What's in the ground ready for seed in the approaching seasons? Rodger, maybe you could start with winter wheat.
Yeah. Our crop plan, and I must start this autumn by saying the crop plan because of the weather, has had to change currently and will continue to change because we're not finished planting yet. But certainly within Group 1 wheats for us, Skyfall is still the biggest seller that we have within Group 1s. Farmers know the risk, but of course, the extended drilling window, because of the need for less vernalization with Skyfall, pulls drilling of that right through into the back end of January, perhaps into February. We have increased our hectarage of Bamford considerably in anticipation of it being on the RL and going forward as a popular variety. But some of the old varieties, or what would now be classed as older varieties, are still pretty big players with us. Dorsum, unsurprisingly, but an increase in the champion hectarage because of demand from growers, and again, yield results that justify being there, with the caveat that you must be aware of the weaknesses that it has. And we still sell more Graham in the marketplace than is proportional to the rest of the trade, because we as Agrii feel that we still understand the Graham as a variety within Group 4 and its place. And as of yet, we don't have a replacement for an early drilled wheat, which is a slot that Graham fills very well for us and our growers.
Thanks, Rodger. Let's now move on to winter barley. John, tell us a bit about what seed stocks are you multiplying? What's in the ground?
Well, as we alluded to, it's predominantly Tardis and Caravel, really. I mean, there are still some requirements for varieties that did well on farm. We've had our own memento from the Sacobra program that served us well for many years, and the USP for that was big bold grain. So that might slide a bit to Caravel now, but predominantly it's those. I think with the blackgrass competition trials this year, we did sort of think that there was perhaps something that Caravel was proving a little bit more interesting. This year's results probably conclude that actually it's still in the pack in terms of 2 rows. So realistically, 2 rows are great, but if you want to optimize your blackgrass competition, then it's got to be a hybrid to really sort of affect that seed head number and the seed return based on the size of that seed head. So for us, again, Kingsbarn is still a very strong variety. We have Armadillo, a variety that didn't make it onto the RL, but had unique brackling or lack of brackling. And that's done well on farm. And as Rodger alluded to, then things like the BYDV and Belfry is still quite a strong, long-standing servant as being the stiffest of the hybrids. So, yeah, there's kind of really only 4 varieties.
Thanks, John. That's winter barley. So now let's move on to oilseed rape. David, what's in the ground in terms of seed multiplication?
Well, it's a challenging autumn for oilseed rape, and there will be many farmers who will be looking at their crops. A lot of crops have been pulled up, and farmers we wait to see whether farmers have stomach for oilseed rape this autumn. Certainly there will be some sticking with it, others will be pulling back on the acreage. The one interesting thing we've found is that there's been as much interest in schemes that help the farmers offset the risks of establishment, and that's driven variety choice, probably more so than new varieties per se. So we anticipate this autumn our big sellers like Ambassador Auckland, X-Steel and NB 1035 will remain big sellers. And those varieties we introduced last year, like Turing with very good disease resistance and Kansas with its spring growth habit, will take up some new acreage. So that will probably remain our focus. Conventionals are less important than they were. Our biggest seller is Aardvark and Amarone with a focus on growth habit, but it's interesting to see Pinnacle come in from an independent plant breeder as a new conventional variety, and then Miraculix to complement Matrix, which has become the mainstay of the Clearfield acreage.
That's great insight as to what's in the ground in terms of winter wheat, winter barley and oilseed rape. But what can growers do to ensure that they can get their hands on the seed stock that they need for their farming business? Rodger.
For me, Tony, it's a very obvious answer, and that's, order your seed as soon as possible, as early as you can. It shouldn't be a last minute decision to plant. Yes, decisions can change depending on yield results as we see going through the season and the performance of crops. But as always, to get the variety of choice you want, the obvious thing is to have discussions early. The price is subjective. The price is wrong if the seed's not delivered on the right day. So the sooner you have it available, the better.
And how can growers use the RL, combine it with all of the other Agrii R&D information that they have to hand to help nurture the crops through the growing season? John, I can see that you're thinking right now.
You can probably hear me thinking as well, Tony. I think it's that sort of list of characteristics or things that you really aren't prepared to budge on. Like a wish list in reverse in a way. And I think if you, particularly with different areas of the farm or because of different regions, that sort of list of priorities, and it's often there's too many varieties in the market. I think at first glance you'd say there is, but I sort of, once you go through what's your top 4 things you want, by the time we've actually gone through that list, if we've only got 1 or 2 options available to you, then we probably didn't start off with too many in the first place. So for me, there's always been a group of growers who have always engaged with new variety in the thought process of that when the RL comes out, which is why we're doing this podcast, but also then engaging in field days earlier on in the season to really see, because I think we've got across all the crops, we've got some great genetics available to us. There's a range of different traits you could really specialize in. If you could be really strong in your list of demands and still end up with a load of good characteristics and good varieties to offer.
And to bring this podcast to a close, perhaps, David, you could offer a final piece of advice.
Don't go to the left-hand side of the list just because it's higher yielding. That can be a misguided judgment. Often the best varieties are sitting in the middle of the pack, and they're supported with much broader characteristics that will deliver longer term.
Thank you, Rodger, John and David, for sharing your expert advice. This podcast qualifies for 1 Basis and 1 Naroso CBD point. And don't forget, the must-have variety guide for 2024 is here. The Agrii Seed Spring Crops Yearbook is packed full of information that we hope you find useful. Link in bio. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.